Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Am I audible?
Can hear you, Dr. Lorna.
Okay, thank you and welcome to this roundtable on Indigenous India's experience and the narrative of Anthropocene. This is a very cozy room. We have about 20 participants. I'd like to welcome you all and thank you for joining us. My name is Lorna Israel from the Department of International Studies, and I am the moderator of this session for this afternoon. And just briefly to frame our mind to this session, the roundtable discussion is an organized conversation around a certain topic for the purpose of adding depth and breadth to the topic. And for this roundtable, the topic revolves around an analysis of Indigenous India's post-colonial Anthropocene. And just to give a brief background on the what's in store for us this afternoon, let me just give you a summary of the abstract by the conversationalists or the presenters. The researchers analyze and frame the indigenous people of India as contributors to the post-colonial Anthropocene narrative. Overall, they discuss a post-colonial analysis of the international relations between the colonizers and the colonized, the indigenous people, and the effects on the global Anthropocene narrative. It aims to open up possibilities for the plurality of approach and idea in shaping the anthropogenic narrative beyond a colonized perspective. Our conversationalists or presenters or discussants for this roundtable are composed of Shane Vinarao, Danielle Rose Mañalac, Francis Therese Zabala, and Wing Z Poon, who cannot join us for some personal emergency reason, but her spirits and her mind is very much with us this afternoon. So with that, I'd like to call on our presenters, if they're ready to do their presentation. And some reminders there, if we can just go over them one by one. Please use appropriate equipment for the webinar. When using a mobile phone, use a headset to reduce the noise that they pick up in your location. Put your phone on silent mode. Avoid talking while the webinar is ongoing. Please keep your microphones on mute at all times. Please be courteous and do not engage in a chat with others while the webinar is ongoing. And you may participate actively and ask your questions during the open forum. So let me now call on our conversationalists and our discussants for this round table. And if we can wrap up our conversation or discussion at around 2:55 p.m., I guess, so that we will have time to move to the next session for this afternoon. Thank you very much and welcome. May we hear from our conversationalists?
Good afternoon. First, I would like to ask if it's necessary to turn on our videos. Ayan, sige. Good afternoon. Can you hear? Hello?
Yes,
Is the sound
Mr.
audible?
Yes, can hear you. Go ahead.
So, good afternoon. My name is Rose, and I have with me today Shane and Therese. Our topic today is on an analysis on. Sorry, I hope you can't hear the marching band in the background. Our topic today is an analysis on Indigenous India's post-colonial Anthropocene. First, I would like to start more on story form. So, we first would like to say that the indigenous people of India are known as custodians of nature. Long before colonialism had taken place, they had customs and beliefs that held nature sacred. They believed that faith the faith and the existence of humanity and nature were intertwined. So they treated nature as a living entity in itself with its own life to be respected, protected, and fulfilled. The indigenous are often stereotyped to be poor, illiterate, and disadvantaged in many other ways, but they have a tremendous understanding of ecosystems and the factors that sustain them. As captured in the words of Sitakant Mahapatra, an Indian poet, he said, they still look upon life as a gift to celebrate, and this ancient earth as one to be praised, worshipped, and also celebrated. They are the one to whom the earth is not something to be used, not a possession or an object for exploitation, but a living entity. An object of reverence and relationship is one of sacred trust and loving intimacy. For they believed as much in celebrating one's life in the world as is remembering, adoring, and celebrating the world in one's life. So, moving on to the part of colonization, as history has told us, we know that Britain came and colonized India. The primary difference of Britain's colonization from other colonizer countries is said to be the practicality of its intent. While others colonized to spread a form of civilization or forms of thought and religion, Britain carried out its colonization for the reason of economic expansion. In our paper, when we talk about the colonization of India, we no longer refer to the physical conquest of the land, but the coloniality of India, how the mindset of economic expansion was left as a colonial attitude of mind, or more precisely, a lingering coloniality. Painting the Anthropocene of India, we see it as not too far from how the colonizers had left it. However, the colonizers no longer hold power, but India has maintained and furthered the destruction of the Anthropocene through its lingering coloniality. There are over about 30 biodiversity hotspots in the world, and India has four of them. The two qualifying criterions to be considered a hotspot are one, you must have a high degree of species native to the land, and two, it has lost at least 70% of its original habitat. For this paper, we focused on Sundaland, the part of which that falls under India is Nicobar Island. The most significant threat to Sundaland's biodiversity is forest destruction as a result of human activity. Mostly commercial and illegal activities done to provide for the demands from China, North America, Europe, and Japan. So you see the form of coloniality. It is exhibited through This exhibits the coloniality of India in that India began to perceive nature more as an object for exploitation than a live being to be respected. The researchers would like to propose to add to the anthropogenic narrative beyond the colonized perspective by bringing back indigenous philosophy. Not so much that we impose deities or rituals to practice, but merely just the philosophy of respect for nature, not necessarily referring to laws either, but the mindset of the indigenous people. We would like to move into post-coloniality by pulling away from the West and the colonizer-colonized perspective narrative in 2 points. First and foremost, we understand that holding the colonizer accountable for the destruction and damage is important to some, but we believe that continuously pointing fingers and provoking them to act on our behalf wouldn't really be that productive. Giving the colonizers the sole responsibility of restoration is somewhat saying that it is still their world as authority and power. But more expanding it into a shared responsibility turns it into a shared power and therefore a shared world. The colonized, in this case India, will take part in the Anthropocene narrative. The colonizers, in this case Britain, will have to accept the role of India in the Anthropocene narrative. Not holding the colonizer solely responsible also makes them accept that the colonizer also part of the narrative, moving away from a colonial hierarchy. We in no form intend to invalidate history, but more that we want to change the narrative and move away from imperialism. And the second point is we move away from coloniality by taking away the objectification of nature and bringing back the indigenous thought of nature as living entities, acknowledging the intertwining fates of humans and nature and how it is a codependent existence that sustains each other. So if my co-presenters would like to add to the presentation, please.
Okay, thank you, Rose, for that substantial start of our roundtable discussion. And I just wanted to add up on our narrative that yes, as we are discussing the analysis of indigenous Indians, post-colonial Anthropocene, we are also encouraging a lifted conversation about the post-colonial effects of Anthropocene in India, because lately we are dominated with scientific and with economic aspects on the Anthropocene. But right now, since we have the indigenous peoples India's knowledge, especially with their traditions and with their customs, it is better, or it is good to open or elevate a discussion or a conversation focusing on the post-colonial effects of indigenous India, rather than focusing on the economic and the scientific aspects of indigenous India. And also, yes, a part of post-colonialism is that we are not putting all the blame from the imperialism, but rather than as post-colonial discussion or a post-colonial discourse, we are encouraging a India's mindset on how do we cope up, how do we manage the effects that the imperialism has left India, and in that way, the indigenous people has a lot and very significant help in moving forward to a post-colonial Anthropocene. Okay, so Reese, do you have any other additional input in our discussion?
Thank you so much, Shane. All right, so I just would like also to add that one of our questions actually in pondering during our discussion is that because of the lack on review of literature, we cannot define what indigenous India really means, because with all of our researches, it is always seen as generalized, and there are no further studies where they only look at one tribe, since there are a lot of subcontinents or subgroups that this scheduled tribe is actually made with. So with the constitutional provision in the Article 366 of India, they said that scheduled tribes is such tribes or tribal communities or parts of or groups within such tribes. So this is the only definition that we are going through and looking around when we say indigenous people of India.
If the audience or our moderator would like to add anything, or
Okay, thank you for that thought-provoking startup of our conversation. And I'd like to note that some of your articulations have been actually highlighted by our keynote speakers this morning, like the whole idea of disrupting the universality of Anthropocene's narrative. And this time you're attempting to, in a sense, disrupt the universalizing tendency of such very familiar terms as imperialism, colonialism, and how does it impact especially on one of the remaining marginal sectors in our society globally, the so-called indigenous people. So with that, maybe we can hear some additional thoughts from our fellow scholars, from those interested in the Anthropocene. What might be your reactions or suggestions or remarks to the presentation of our conversationalists? Let's begin our conversation now. Maybe as a start, I'd like to ask our conversationalist, what attracted you to the topic? What was the trigger? Why take on this topic?
Ms. Lawrence, actually, first, because the post-colonial narrative or the post-colonial concept have started in India. And second, because as a Filipino or in the Philippines, we've considered a country that is near in the characteristics or in the developing status of our country, the Philippines. That's why we use India as a good model for analyzing the post-colonial Anthropocene in their indigenous.
Okay. May we hear from the other attendees, their thoughts? All right, I'd like to recognize Sir Romerokuraming. Thank you very much for joining us. Go ahead,
Good
sir.
afternoon.
Nice to
Thank
hear you
you.
and nice to see you.
Yeah. Same
Yeah.
here, Ma'am Lorna.
Yes, of course.
Good afternoon.
We were in Cebu the last time.
Yeah,
Now we are everywhere and anywhere.
that's right.
Right. Go ahead,
Yeah,
Romel.
thank you the conversation, the panelists for raising those kind of questions and issues. I'm just wondering, why why not the indigenous from the Philippines? I'm just wondering, yeah, why go as far as India to discuss this kind of issues? Because I believe indigenous communities in the Philippines actually is one of the countries where the indigenous movement is really strong, and that is reflected particularly in the social indigenization of social sciences. So we know we have a long tradition of indigenization of the social sciences in the Philippines, going back to 60s, 70s. So we can easily point out to Pantayang Pananaw, uh, Filipino, Psikologiyang Pilipino, and others. So yeah, I'm just curious, why India and not the Philippines so far as indigenous community? Thanks.
Thank you, Sir Romerokuraming. Actually, we do agree with that. That maybe we should have gone. We were actually thinking of going into the indigenous culture of the Philippines, but one of the reasons that we didn't push through it was mostly because it's a narrative that's probably too close to home, and we didn't want to interpret it in a more biased way. It's very, very close to us. We actually really study the indigenous people of the Philippines, and we didn't want to go into it because we might act to. We wanted it to be a more balanced narrative and discussion, and we felt like if we went to the Philippines, we wouldn't be able to balance it that much because we would have a more biased perspective. Thank you.
Romel, how do we address that? It's too close to home.
One thing that I think
It
we can do.
hurts.
Yeah.
May ganon, di ba? Hmm.
Yeah, totoo yan. Totoo yan na mas mahirap
Mas mahirap, di ba?
ano pag
Entangled siya
sarili.
eh. Oo.
Yeah.
Oo. Mm-mm.
On the other hand, yung pagiging malapit din naman, being close to home, that also makes makes the issues much more pressing, much more real.
Right.
And it's not just an intellectual exercise, but it's also, yeah, we can relate to it more on a more day-to-day or everyday kind of life matter. But I can accept your justification, and perhaps it's also more interesting to look into places beyond our fences, right? So we're already familiar with what's happening in the Philippines, so might as well we take a look at what's happening elsewhere. And India is a good place to explore indigenization. Yeah.
Right.
Thanks.
But we can further explore that. No? Let me ask the conversationalist, having applied the concept to a non-Filipino setting, and perhaps going back now to our own setting, how do you see now the Philippine indigenous community? And in terms of, the narrative or the discourse of the Anthropocene, having applied it already to the Indian indigenous community, how would you now see our own indigenous community in terms of the narrative of the Anthropocene? Is it still very close, or would you be able to put some distance to it? Well, there's a question here from Ismail. It's related to the question that we're trying to pursue, no? Trying to bring back to our own backyard, no? Post-coloniality, Anthropocene. So do you see any comparison with our own indigenous communities? Using now your data or your conversation about India's community.
Yes, we do see any comparison with our indigenous communities. Actually, we have considered modeling a comparative study between the India and the Philippines indigenous people as part of the inspiration of our paper. And then the common ground that we have usually see is, of course, first the discussion or the discourse on the environment, on how the Philippine indigenous people and the India's indigenous people make or illustrate their indigenous people as one of the as the primary groups in safeguarding the environment, and so that it enters in the discussion of human and environment relations in the discourse of Anthropocene.
So the similarities is in terms of how they take care of the environment. Okay, thank you for that. Any additional thought from our participants? Either you type your thoughts in the chat box or raise your hand to be recognized. Thank you. Okay, si Sir Romel ulit. Romel, sir. go
Okay,
ahead.
yeah. So let's keep the conversation going. It's common when we talk about Anthropocene that one of the ways how scholars approaches is go indigenous, because we can find in
Oh.
indigenous a system, a way of life, the thinking that that might address the root of this anthropocenic challenges. So from the philosophical standpoint, taking a look at Anthropocene, we can go as far back as that kind of mindset, the change in the way how humans and nature relation. Before, humans are just part of nature. So the transformation of that kind of relationship where humans dominated nature, that's the starting point of all this kind of anthropocenic problems that led us to this kind of situation. So it's easy to understand why scholars would go back to the indigenous. But Anthropocene is a problem that is it may have a very deeply philosophical roots to that moment, but the Anthropocene in itself is much larger than that. The challenge is already, yeah, it's global, it's geological. So I wonder to what extent you think going indigenous could really help in addressing this kind of problem, because we, the modern day people, we cannot imagine that we will live in that kind of situation like the indigenous people do. We are so used to a different way of life. Our mentality is so different, and demanding them to act and think like indigenous, that might be too much to ask. So if the solution, if there is a need for us to act in order to solve the problem that is Anthropocene, do you think, to what extent do you think the indigenous way of thinking and living could really address this kind of problem?
Okay, may we hear the response of that's an eternal question, di ba, Romel?
Yes,
We go indigenous, the fact that we're so modernized.
that's right.
And because maybe we also have an assumption that the indigenous people are not modernized. Maybe that's a wrong assumption, because we're supposed to be part
Yeah.
of this world already, right?
That's right. Yeah.
That's right. Okay, but let's hear our conversationalists. What are their additional thoughts? Go ahead.
Thank you for giving us another point to talk about, Sir Romel. Well, actually, we were talking about exactly just that last night as a group. The first thing, just like Miss Lorna mentioned, that there's always an argument about what is modernized, and there's also a counter discourse talking about how it's the civilization process brought about by the West as well. That's also part of a post-colonial narrative. Decolonization is moving away from thinking that the indigenous are not necessarily modernized. Well, that's one point, but our main answer would probably be something like, as we talked about it last night, we're not necessarily imposing fully the indigenous ways because we know that that's not feasible for most of us. Like, we can't we naturally we have, a lot of us have different cultures and a lot of us have different religions, so we can't necessarily impose that you treat the trees like a deity, or you sambahin mo yung mga things in nature na parang Diyos, because we can't impose that. So for us, we're only taking the mere philosophy of just respecting nature as a living entity from the indigenous people, and then moving that forward. We're thinking that possibly mainstreaming that thought. The comparison that we used last night was, think in terms of gender, like how before it was a far thought idea, and then it was mainstreamed, slowly integrated into society, and then it was mainstreamed into a common thought. So that's what we were talking about last night, to mainstream the idea of nature as a living entity more than just an object of exploitation, and not necessarily going full-blown indigenous. Yes, thank you.
And what about the fellow conversationalists? Can we, for the benefit of a smooth discussion, can we stick to the English language? However, we don't want to speak it. Okay. Yeah. Yes, Shane, you want to add to the conversation?
Okay, I just want to add this, that regarding about the modernization of the indigenous people, one way that we have taught in our paper or in our data is that in the post-colonial narrative, it was also left in India in general, including the indigenous people, that the imperialist period have left industrialized or moving forward to the globalization of India during the Industrial Revolution and other industrial periods in India. And whereas the indigenous people have then we know that in the indigenous knowledge, they are not completely with the idea of the industrialization or in the advancement and development. But then, since the imperialism period have left the industrialization and the development in India, so in that case, we can at least say today that indigenous people are also living in a modernized or a global part of the globalization of what the imperialism have left India in general. So indigenous people are also benefiting in that kind of narrative.
Therese, do you have additional thoughts?
All right. So adding to what Ate Rose mentioned, actually, yes, last night we were actually talking about how can we look at this in the concept of globalization, because since we know that indigenous people, as I've said earlier, we cannot really define who they are in terms of all the literatures that we read, since because of this scheduled tribes, it was only this sixth schedule or the sixth amendment of their constitution that they were incorporated as recognized to what they call the scheduled tribes. So right now, one literature of Chakravarti actually just recently, he mentioned that the sixth schedule holds the potential to redefine community engagement and restore forest management. So there are different forest acts that incorporates or recognizes these scheduled tribes, but it is only that. So we were thinking that the feasibility of just looking the indigenous people, that we should go beyond this conversation, because with this forest acts, it seems that they're only locking the indigenous people in this kind of aspect, that they are only for the management of the forest. So it is a very it is actually one of the questions that we had to yesterday with in terms of the modern day and the globalization concept. So, but for now, I think this is we are only tackling, but we furthering our paper in terms of that one po. So, that's all.
Thank you, Therese. Do we have some additional points from our participants in the room? Don't be shy. Feel free to give us your thoughts. Thinking is allowed.
Miss Lorna.
Yes, Rose, go ahead.
If we may as well, that's actually one of the primary questions of our study is whether or not bringing back traditions would be a resolution or it would exacerbate the situation. So if we could also raise that question to participants and maybe that they would like to engage with that.
Right. Maybe you can reiterate the question so that we're looking at the same page. Romila, are you still raising your hand? I saw Miss Mel's hand also was raised.
Really? I didn't. No. Already lowered my hand. Oh, okay. So wait.
You have to lower it.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Sige.
Sorry.
So, Rose, can you pose the question for us to, grapple with it? And as our keynote speaker said this morning, there are hard questions that we need to grapple with. And, it might worth the try. All right. So here's the question for everybody to ponder upon. Would bringing back tradition be a resolution, or will it exacerbate the situation? The situation being the environmental destruction.
Yes, Miss, the situation of the Anthropocene currently in India as a more colonial, yes, as how Anthropocene was already the forest destruction and how India left the Anthropocene basically as how the colonizers already left it and actually made it worse and further the destruction. So if bringing back traditions of indigenous people would be a resolution or would it exacerbate that situation?
Okay. Is that fine for everyone to ponder upon? So bringing back traditions, alleviate or pose some resolution or measures.
Yeah, I think that goes into the heart of the question. All these talks about indigenous insofar as the Anthropocene is concerned will, that very question, that will it really address the problem, or it might exacerbate even the situation? Probably what we can the area where indigenous thinking and way of life might fit into the whole effort to address Anthropocene. Perhaps it's not in going back to tradition as a way of life, but as I've noted earlier, we are all so used to the comfort of the modern day life, and it's except for a few who would like to really go back to that kind of life, and they actually do it. So you can see them on YouTube, for example, having their own adventure being traditional. But for most of us, we don't like to do that. So how do we? The question is, how do we fit? How do we make use of the indigenous thoughts and way of life, perhaps, in as part of our effort to address Anthropocene? So that's basically the question, and I believe the philosophies and the way of life that indigenous communities have lived and acquired, that perhaps might serve as some kind of how do I put it? That might help in conscientization, making us modern. We modern people, so-called modern people. That's a way by which we can think of ourselves, some kind of a mirror that will allow ourselves to compare our own values and beliefs, and remind what we have left behind. So the indigenous people have this kind of philosophies, and that's precisely the kind of mental thoughts that we have long abandoned. And by putting that as some kind of a mirror by which we can see ourselves in, it might help us think um, the limits to our own modern mentality. Okay, because one of the problems in modern mentality is the idea that things should be progress is continuous, and our effort is really to go as far as we could. Okay, so that doesn't allow us to see. That doesn't allow us to pause for a while whether that mentality is really the kind of mentality that we should pursue. So by looking into life and thoughts of indigenous people, and we can perhaps see that, well, they have their own way of life, and some of them, without romanticizing the indigenous people, but these indigenous people have their own way of life, and they can be happy with that kind of way of life. So that somehow gives us some food for thought. To what extent is our modern values and modern mentality really have given us the kind of life that we like to live? Yeah, I think that's all that I can share.
Thank you, Romel. But quoting Bruno Latour, sabi niya, we are never modern.
That's
So
right.
that's a good idea. That's a
That's
good
right.
idea. Diba?
Yeah.
We were never modern. We've always been traditional. We've always been a stickler to tradition. But I think, for the purpose of moving forward the discussion before I call on Ms. Mel, I like the idea of the thought, the mentality, the values, and how we can use those values of the so-called indigenous people to mirror or to look at ourselves. Are we really modern, or are they really? Sorry. No. I think I like that. It's we rather than bringing it back to a way, of promoting a way of life, that the indigenous way of life is a better way of living because it's not consumption driven. But what are the life's lessons that we can apply? And for lack of a better term, we're simply going to use to our modern life. And maybe we can derive some lessons from there. And conversely, maybe the so-called indigenous people can also mirror themselves in terms of the so-called modernity. That, hey, that kind of modern life we can apply, and we can find it productive and useful for us. But that alone, Romel, is very provocative. What indigenous values or ideas can we use, to mirror, to look at ourselves as modern and in the light of Anthropocene, because we want plurality, right? So maybe part of that plurality is the philosophical thoughts and values of the indigenous people. That's one research area that we can pursue later. All right?
I add to that, Miss.
Yeah, sige. Go
Just
ahead,
to
Rose.
further reiterate Sir Romel's point, which we fully agree with, quoting from online discourses is that decolonization isn't reverting back to life 600 years ago. It's bringing a new harmony and balance that's informed by our ancestors. Decolonization is uprooting the colonial capitalist system as a whole and making a world where no one lives at the expense of another. So we agree that it's not necessarily going back and reverting, but more taking from the past and applying it to the future, to the present.
Therese and Shane, do you have additional thought before I call on some people have comments or questions?
Um,
Go ahead.
okay. Lastly, I would just like to acknowledge, and yeah, I would agree with Sir Romel. And then if we connect it with the discussion or the paper, I also agree with you, Ms. Lorna, that we will never be modernized. We will always lean in the traditional ways, especially in the indigenous discourse, that the practices and the traditional cultures have been very significant to the indigenous people. So the challenge for us in the Anthropocene narrative is on how do we balance this kind of discussion without neglecting the traditions that indigenous people refer it as a very sacred to them. So that's all. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me call on Miss Mel. Miss Mel?
Yes, okay. I was already typing my my
Oo.
my piece, but anyway, yes, I agree with Dr. Romel and what Miss Lorna said earlier, and of course Rose and Shane, no, that really cannot go back fully to that, to what we used to do, no, and there's really no replay button. No? We cannot revert back, or we can, or if we can, no, it's still very limited, no. So what we can do now is just to find that balance, no, between our tradition and modernization, or in this kind of development that we're having, and making sure that we don't jeopardize our environment, we don't destroy each other. And I think in terms of the involvement of the indigenous communities, this is where we need to engage them more, no, in the development processes, no, across all levels of decision making. And so, for instance, if we're talking about mining or agricultural activities or other similar activities, no, it's the indigenous communities who know a lot more about them, and we need to involve them before crafting, no, any policies or before implementing any programs, no. And we all know that development can both be good or bad, no. So, but it's how we do, no, community development and engaging the communities that we're dealing with. So I think that's very important. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Miss Mel. At this point, I'd like to call Sir Bart to articulate or verbalize his comments, which is on the chat box. Is that all right, Kev?
Hello po, good afternoon. Yes,
Because it's not a question, it's, you know, it's a statement, part of the conversation. Go ahead, Kev.
yeah, so actually, I agree with all the what has been discussed earlier, that it's really hard to go back, no, and we also need to rethink that, not not because indigenous practices have this philosophy of protecting the environment, regarding the environment as uh, as a communal is the answer to the ongoing to the issue at hand. We need to also rethink that some practices are actually harmful or detrimental to the environment. So as I've indicated, like the practices of burning are actually harmful to the environment, as well as some well, that's why we have the pandemic, because of some practices of eating exotic foods, no, and that's actually harmful to the existence of not only for us but also the entire uh, you know uh, humanity, no. So I think if we have to really look at a post-colonial approach to our Anthropocene, we need to really balance and rethink of what current ways and what old ways are appropriate in resolving the issue. I think that's all.
Thank you, Kev. There's a question here in the chat box, and I'd like to invite everyone to answer this, not just our conversationalist. Question is from John Rother. Do you think the thought of being traditional and the thought, so that there's an emphasis on the thought of being modernized, meet at equilibrium to pursue the problems of the Anthropocene?
Thank you, John Ruther, for the question. And again, going back, we did between the traditional and between the modernized on how do we meet it in Anthropocene, there will always be a balance on how do we manage both the traditional perspective and the modernization, because we can't choose only one between the two. Because first, with the traditional, we must never neglect the traditional values that our indigenous people have met or have identified. And next, we can't pause modernization, because in the age of globalization, again, we need that as a country, and also in our to progress and to strengthen our discourse on Anthropocene, and also in mitigating the challenges of Anthropocene.
Thank you for that, Shane. What about the others? Let's all engage with the question. Yes, Therese, go ahead.
I'd like to add po na I think I'm sorry. I agree with all of the conversations, and I think it can be possible that there's sort of like meeting halfway with what Sir Keb and Dr. Mel has mentioned, that in terms of the practices of the indigenous people, that where we can get those practices, some of the practices, and then meet it with the what we've been saying, the modern day, for the crafting of policies and strengthening them, since actually they have been trying to establish this in some way with the Forest Act that I mentioned earlier, since these legislations would actually allow these indigenous people to recognize that they own that land, but they have their own authority for those with the use of that land, to protect that land, to have their own regulations over the management of these forests. So I think there is already a line, not really a line, but a meeting point within those two, that the traditional and at the same time integrating what we can proceed with the modern time in the bringing of the policy, etc., through those laws such as the Forest Act management.
I would also like to add, Ms. Lawrence.
Go ahead.
I think one thing that's interesting to look at here is the question, do you think the thought of being traditional and the thought of being modernized? In our study, what's interesting was what was brought up earlier as well. In our study, we never actually used the term modernized, because we always used it in terms of colonized and colonized and colonizers. So modernized is a very subjective term. So I would just like to note how interesting that is. And in our study, we're not necessarily connecting the traditional and the modernized, but more sort of like bringing back the value to a more contemporary time that is based on capitalism. So we're sort of bringing back more of a humanizing form to it. Ayun, that's all. Thank you.
Right, thank you. I hope John Rother is around. John, are you there? And perhaps we would like to hear your response to the response to your question. John, are you there? Ayun. What do you think? How would you respond to the response?
Ma'am, I think, sorry for the environment. So ma'am, if we could have balance of the thought of being traditional and modernized, we can actually create a solution for that Anthropocene. Because if we could see that in that particular earlier discussions, that being traditional has problems too and being modernized problems. If we could just combine that positivities between the two, we could meet that equilibrium, right, ma'am?
So, John, you're positive that at some point, no, that the two can meet for a better world, perhaps. No, the two can actually meet, regardless of some of the questions that we may encounter along the way. No, we would take out some of the positives from the indigenous values, and apply that to the way we're conducting our lifestyle now, and maybe we could achieve some amount of balance. Thank you, John, for joining the conversation. May we hear from the others? Romel, go ahead, Romel.
Okay. One thing that is quite clear, or what's quite prominent in the idea of Anthropocene, is the notion of urgency, because that idea that we're reaching that kind of tipping point, that if we don't do anything drastic now, then that will be a downhill from all the way from there. So that the kind of adaptive perhaps that kind of thoughts that we're going to make some kind of meeting halfway, that would already be within the realm of the adaptation rather than mitigation or prevention. If we already reach that point, the balance has been tipped, and then so that's the moment that the conversation will have to deal with how do we go about dealing with all this kind of very harsh climatic or environmental condition. So yeah, so the point I'm trying to highlight here is if we haven't reached that point yet, when we still have that kind of hope that somehow we can arrest this kind of anthropocenic condition by cutting on the CO2, all this kind of needs, we have to do something really very drastic, and adaptive measures might not be that the one that is needed. We are going to go for adaptive measures once that point has already been reached. But for now, perhaps the greater challenge is how do we come up with drastic measures to address to help us arrest the situation, and to what extent indigenous thinking might be of help. Perhaps I'm just thinking that perhaps indigenous thinking might be helpful during the next phase, that kind of adaptation. But for the drastic ones, it's really the realm of the policymakers, and this should come from the most powerful countries, and they have the most resources and the most power to do something about it, but they're not the ones doing something about it. Yeah, that's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Romel. Before I'd like to respond to your response, Sir Romel, before I call on Archil. And I appreciate the fact that you raised the notion of urgency, because that's speed, and it has something to do with time, the end of time, the end of the world. And maybe the indigenous people, they don't have clocks, their clocks are actually the moon, the sun, the stars. Maybe they have a different concept of time, so they have a different concept of speed and how things should proceed. Maybe we can investigate that. And I'm raising this point because Archil has a good idea that she posted here in the chat box, and I'd like her to invite to join the conversation with her wonderful voice. Archil, can you please join us and verbalize your thoughts here in the chat box, if that's all right?
Yes, sure. Good
you.
Afternoon to everyone. I'm sorry I could not activate my camera right now because of some Wi-Fi problems, but I hope I'm audible enough. Anyway, as I was typing in the chat box, I'm actually looking, my major concern really is because there is at least one 2021 article by, I forgot, Jackson, on decolonizing the Anthropocene, and actually zeroes in on the idea of urgency, and that it can be easily hijacked by alarmists and those who have the greater hand in the policy formation. those people who could be or who are in the position to actually capitalize things for further profit. So there is a lot of coloniality associated with the tendency to make things urgent. So it would be good to really, that's why I was saying in what I typed here, that it would be ideal to juxtapose not just indigenous, because yeah, that's what we usually call as, you know, their traditional knowledge, but of course with the interplay of colonization, there would now be the so-called endogenous, is coming from the inside. It's part of border thinking, that we also respect such bodies of knowledge, but that not every indigenous or endogenous knowledge may be scientifically sound. So it would be good to put them together and know where to balance, plus the context, because it's possible that in your formula, you are able to listen to the indigenous and or the endogenous knowledge and then have it verified, validated by scientific knowledge and vice versa. But the local context, the local flavor would not make it a good fit. So it is important. And also, it is important also because when you have conversations, we note, of course, that there can be only one speaker or a few speakers at a time. So we really run the risk of silencing alternative ideas or marginalizing what we consider to be the anthropogenic agency, especially from the global south. So it is important to maintain conversations that I think that people from the global south would really need to converse with each other first, snowball into, I don't know if that is more anti-decolonial or something, but, you know, gather the momentum, because this is something that we articulate as common peoples from the global south. We have our own demands and we need to be heard, we deserve to be heard, so that the people from the global north will also have, you know, that sense of accountability. Not everybody from the global north, of course, but maybe converse with those who are sympathetic from the global north, so that we can streamline our energies and our knowledge base to make the right solutions for what we actually need, especially in the global south, and make those who are responsible truly accountable, the reparation kind of thing. And then, of course, being mindful of our local contexts. Thank you for hearing me out on my ideas.
Thank you, Archil. And I think, you know, the conversation, especially in this part of the world or the so-called global south, is very important to keep it going, particularly because there is a tendency to silence, if not disregard, so-called unscientific thoughts, because there's a high premium put on the scientificity of things. You know? And we're not saying that the scientific ones, you know, are to be ignored, but we're also saying, you know, that there are also thoughts and ideas that may be just as scientific as the others would claim it. So that's why it's important that our conversation in this part of the world is put on the table and is continued and kept alive. Thank you, Archil, for that wonderful contribution. And I think in the spirit of not being silenced, if I can hear some additional thoughts from the others. And maybe some response also from our conversationalist. So the discussion now has been rendered complex, as layered by the sense of urgency, the scientificity, and silenced voices or some unscientific thought. So the whole parameters or trajectory of indigenous, post-coloniality, and the Anthropocene. It's becoming complex now, and I suppose becoming harder. Yes, may we hear additional thought from our conversationalist, perhaps?
Thank you, attorney. Actually, I don't have any additional thoughts, but we will just like to acknowledge and recognize how this substantial thoughts could help in the direction of our discussion or in our study on the Anthropocene, especially emphasizing the scientific knowledge and how it helps in informing such solutions and precautions as a good fit without the further silencing the alternative ideas of our indigenous peoples. And then we also like to acknowledge the thoughts on anthropogenic agency, especially coming from the global south. So that will be a very good help in our in the direction of our study.
Okay, there's some comment here from Sir Keb. Okay, let's address this. I think this is a question for everybody. Since we've talked about urgency, how do we influence our policymakers to consider such framework in solving the issue? So, Keb, you're saying that how do we also ensure that the policymakers would act with urgency? Is that what you're saying? All right. So how do we inspire them to move with urgency? Any thoughts on this? From the top of our head? We know that it's quite difficult to move our policymakers. I mean, it takes them forever because their clocks are dead. So the sense of urgency is not so much apparent. Okay, yes, let's grapple with this question.
Okay, for me, Ms. Lawrence, I would just like to add on this, since we are talking about the urgency on how do we influence the policymakers and such resolving these kinds of issue. I think we will maximize the use of as an international studies or in the international community discourse. We must first maximize the use of our treaties, of our international dialogues. I think that's a stepping stone in resolving this kinds of issue. So that's my thoughts. And for the Anthropocene, since it talks about the environment and the indigenous knowledge, maybe we can maximize the units of UN, especially the UNFCCC, and also other dialogues that are related in these kinds of issue.
Okay, additional thoughts to that sense of urgency that we need the policymakers to perform?
I think yeah, the COP26 is a good showcase of how difficult this is really, is really going to be. And one of the major difficulties lies in the nature of power itself. Those who have the greatest power and therefore should be more responsible, more accountable. Those who have the greatest power have the tendency to avoid responsibility. So those who have the greatest power, they tend to think that they have the power because they deserve it. And what is there for us to just take. So there is no power. Power creates its own truth. So these powerful people, they wish to think that they have no responsibility for what happened, for what has been happening. And that is the major source of difficulties here. People who have the greatest power and resources to do something about it, they are also the most hesitant to do what really needs to be done. So what has been happening is just the theatrics of doing something. The theatrics of doing something, creating that impression that they're doing something. And I think COP26 is something like that. The liberal world is trying to stage some kind of issue that they are doing something about it, but they cannot admit to themselves that that in reality they cannot, because because of the nature of their position as politicians, as the powerful. So that's, I think, is what's most difficult to overcome, the nature of power itself. And what can we do to impose, to force them to be accountable, to hold on to that kind of accountability? That's why in the early morning discussion by Dr. Dalia, when she mentioned that she doesn't like to go into blaming and the question of accountability, I think that that is one of the major issues that really need to be addressed, because without accepting accountability, these people will not really do something about it. Yeah,
Right.
thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Romel. Yes, it's a sticky situation ever since. No? But actually, when calling the government to action, in the Rio 2012 UN Summit Conference, the discourse of Anthropocene had actually entered already the UN system. And in fact, that UN Summit on Sustainable Development opened with a video, which is actually my presentation tomorrow, a part of my presentation tomorrow. It opened with a video entitled "Welcome to the Anthropocene." Basically, you know, how our ozone layer already has so many holes in it, you know, loss of biodiversity, etc. It was actually meant to frame, or for the delegates to adopt the Anthropocene framework. But the 45,000 delegates ignore it, didn't take into account, and basically upheld poverty as the overarching goal of sustainable development. Whereas the Anthropocene was arguing we need to save the planet. So, and that was one of the disappointments, no, Keb, of the delegates. There was no sense of urgency felt by the UN system and the government all over the world. It was ignored. So maybe, I don't know, no, some imaginaries and some way of selling them or conveying them the idea is it's a big challenge really for all of us. Thank you, Romel. And in any case, we have here, well, anyway, Kev, maybe we can learn something from it in what you're doing with BARM, and you're actually pushing the legislator. Does that mean that they felt the sense of urgency? Kev, are you still there?
I think the good thing about having pushing for this and trying to influence the policymakers in BARM is that BARM is just is at its early year phase, no. So I think there is a greater possibility of having this one, but I think again the word itself, Anthropocene, is alienating to them. So I think there's some sort of like raising an eyebrow on the topic on the proposed agency. So if this would be a successful, then that would be a good step, first step to being a model to other government as well.
Right. Thank you, Kev. And actually, that's also my concern, no? Because this is a new, or supposedly a new term, and people will need to be acclimatized to it. No? Maybe with some way of localizing the whole notion of Anthropocene so that everybody can relate to it. For lack of a better term, we are dealing with it now, and there are some limitations to it. But maybe how can we localize it so that, you know, maybe that's one of the areas of concern, that our legislators or officials cannot feel the urgency or cannot relate to it because the very term is not friendly to their ears or eyes. Maybe a way to find out is how do we translate that into our own language. And then, okay, this another question here in the chat box from Ismail, and if we can pay attention to it. Can we consider the concept of sustainable cities as something that can address the challenges of Anthropocene. Anybody here are familiar with the concept or notion of sustainable cities?
I think Ms. Lors or Ms. Mel, it is interrelated, since in the sustainable cities, it is part of the UN SDG in the 2030 agenda. And then since it is according to the UNDP that everything in the goals of the 17 goals of the UN SDGs is interrelated, so the indigenous peoples will be beneficial to this, especially that if we are putting the balance between the modern and the traditional knowledge. So it is inevitable for the sustainable cities to be tackled in this study. And then for the question that if they can address the challenges of the Anthropocene, I think there is in some point, but there are more challenges, since we can't remove the idea of traditional knowledge when we are talking about the indigenous Anthropocene. So that's my thoughts on the sustainable cities.
Right. But there's a caveat here, or some word of caution from Archiel, that we must veer away from the propensity to impose best practices of one size fits all solution. So we must be wary of that. Okay, any additional thoughts from the others? Maybe before I end this session, I'd like to bring back our conversationalist, and I'm just posing this question to further guide everybody, and in terms of what other areas to be explored using the Anthropocene and the whole notion, and it's an anchoring, on the indigenous community, particularly in the Philippines. And there's a strong call for that, and it's possible. But as the developer or as the initiator of this paper and as a scholar, what have been your greatest challenges in conceptualizing this paper, especially using the concept of Anthropocene and layering it to a post-colonial term, and putting inside there the indigenous people of India? And I'm asking this, to further guide us how to further explore this topic. What have been your greatest challenges or difficulties?
Miss, I think one of the really greatest challenges is that defining what indigenous India really means, since most of the literatures that we saw anchors this indigenous India to the definition of what scheduled tribes is. And in terms of with the Constitution, when we look at it, indigenous scheduled tribes is actually, there's no further definition on what and who they are. And when we search on the list of what these scheduled tribes are, there are really a lot. It's more than 100 of them. So we cannot point on which tribe we want to look into. So I think that's one of the greatest challenges. It is until last night that we were debating among ourselves, what should we look into just one tribe? Do we generalize it like what the literature is saying? So those are a few of the really core questions that we kept on pondering upon, since we wanted to forward the discourse, not only of course with the indigenous people of India, but again, furthering with what we've been talking about with in terms of the modern times. So actually, as far as we have had the conversation, it's very interesting, and it's it looks like as if we are tying up everything now, from especially with what Attorney Archie has mentioned earlier. I really like how she tried to put our study piece by piece, and I think this would create a much better formula on how we want to forward a framework, because as I see it, it looks like it's a working framework now, that there should be a balance, there should be a thin line on verification of scientific knowledge. We have to talk about the indigenous people as well, and then what with Dr. Mel has mentioned, the sustainable cities. So we were discussing, I think this is one point that we can discuss also, since I think we can compare this, because with sustainable cities, there might be more on, it might only bring about more on technology, the identification per se, but I think this is something that we can also work on. So thank you so much for all the insights that was gathered for this RTP.
Thank you, Therese. And as scholars, we need to put on the table what are our difficulties, and so that we can improve on those difficulties. Yes, Shane? What about you?
I agree with Reese. The challenges that are the part of our study that we find most challenging is that the definition of the indigenous in the Anthropocene itself. And then just to add up also, what I can see another challenges that I've thought upon doing this study or conducting this study is that on how do we elevate the conversation of post-colonialism to the Anthropocene, because again the domineering discussion on scientific and economic is a lot when it comes to the study of Anthropocene. But with the post-colonial narrative, it's still few and it's still developing. So and then everything that we have gathered today in the discussion, especially from Sir Romel, from Sir Keb, and from Attorney Arshel, and Miss Lorna and Miss Mel, we will consider everything, the thoughts that was put on the table to the continuance and the improvement of our study. So that's very big help and very substantial to us.
Rose?
Similarly to what Therese mentioned a while ago, we have more on the problem of a lack of literature. For example, we wanted to actually concretize our steps more, and we wanted to give more specific ways on what the indigenous people would do to hold the ground sacred, but then they would only generalize it. They already generalized it in terms of which tribes, and they generalized it as well in terms of what they do. They said that the tribes had myths, they had songs, they had festivals, which aren't really things that we can put forward in terms of what to do. So what we were given today by Attorney Arch, Miss Mel, Sir Romel, it gave us a more concrete solution to what we wanted to do and what we have to look into to see how to, as Shane said, elevate the discussion on the Anthropocene of India. So thank you very much for all of your inputs, and we note all of it to further our research. Thank you.
Thank you. And perhaps, just to give a further context to this roundtable discussion, and later on I'd call Sir Romel and Archil again. Our conversationalists are young scholars or emerging scholars, and in FISO, we are very sensitive to how maybe we are to the whole notion or the politics of marginality or silencing voices. And we encourage everybody, young scholars, emerging scholars, to participate and put some thoughts, or some starting points for conversation. So with that context, I'd like to hear from our, again, for lack of a better term, seasoned scholars like Sir Romel and Archil, a few additional tips or thoughts or advice to these young scholars. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Ma'am Lorna.
Yes,
I remember.
they need that, yes.
I remember a few years ago when I started joining FISO. And one thing that really struck me, and up to now I still remember very clearly, was the fact that I was impressed by presentations even by undergraduate students. I remember in Davao, it was in Davao, yeah, and undergraduate and master's students. So the young generation of scholars, I was happy to see that we have a lot of students who are really very capable. And I was struck by the kind of topics they work on and the presentation skills that they had. So I think this, have attended so many international conferences, and the conferences that are being organized by PISO seems to be one of the very few that allows undergraduate students to participate. And I really salute, kudos to the leadership of PISO for making it inclusive like that. Because one thing I find in young students' presentation is that kind of passion, that kind of grit, that kind of you can feel the energy and the enthusiasm, something that you can hardly feel when you attend these usual conferences, because people are already on their top of their careers. They are already in the careerist mode, and hearing young people like you doing something like this, tackling the issues of Anthropocene and post-colonialism, I really, you're lucky to be exposed to this kind of new ideas. Because during my time when I was still in undergrad and doing masters in UP, for example, there is nothing like this during our time. So you can hardly, you just rely on what you read. So this kind of conversation, when I went overseas, and that's when I heard of this kind of ideas and all these things. How come people in UP, for example, was not talking something about like that? Yeah, so I really admire FISO for doing the format of this conference and other conferences like this, accommodating to younger scholars, emerging scholars, because that is really good for the community, as well as also very good for the students to be exposed as early as now to this kind of discourses that set the bar high for them to aspire to. During our time, during my time in UP, there's nothing like that. What I heard, my professors at UP were talking is they were fighting against one another, throwing all these kind of negative things about their fellow colleagues. So something that is not really very inspiring to be an academic, but for you to have this kind of opportunity, get feedbacks from other scholars, that is, I can imagine that should be inspiring, and that kind of thing that I really enjoy attending PISO conferences. Thank you.
Thank you, Romel. You are very inspiring as always.
Thank you.
And we need really to motivate and inspire younger scholars, diba? More and more.
That's true. Yeah.
Thank you, Romel. Thank you.
Welcome.
Archil, another inspirational word from you. I know you're a great mentor as well, and we need greater mentors also along the way.
Yes. Okay. Thank you so much. It's something that I don't feel I deserve to be placed alongside, seasoned, quote unquote, seasoned scholars like Dr. Romel. But I am just a beginning researcher. So I would say I'm there in the middle, and I really salute the students for pursuing this. What I can say, actually, I did have this interview with FISO when we were releasing the book on international studies last August 2020. And in that interview, I was asked what my advice would be for young scholars. And I would reiterate that, we are still very much locked. Well, a lot of the schools in academia, Philippine academia, still very much locked into Western IR concepts and even textbooks. What I truly appreciate now is that, when you open doors for conversations such as this, for novel ideas, for fresh ways of looking at things, it has this wonderful multiplier effect. And it is important that they are picked up by the young scholars, those who are really hungry and thirsty for new things, for new knowledge, for new solutions to age-old problems, whether, of course, including emergent problems, but even the enduring issues of the international. So I would like to tell the students right now, the budding researchers, how fortunate you are, and you cherish, you really put premium to what you have right now, because not every student is blessed with the opportunity that you have. You're given the platform, the avenue to be able to pursue something that you are really passionate about, whilst expanding your horizons and flexing your academic wings. It's not constricting the way people from my generation, the Jurassic era, we had to contend with old traditional, even old school, no? The old school ways of doing things, very Western. But now you have mentors. You have Miss Lawrence, Doc Mel. You have people who are able to show new pathways for you to explore and to really learn more things. The problem with the oldies tend to be really how to unlearn things, and that's why we see a lot of schools still, still being trapped with the Western, the global North-centric ideas. It is good that your generation, you people, would be able to show your peers from other schools that here we are in academia, and yes, there are openings in academia right now. We have mentors, and it is possible to actually go beyond the Western-centric ways of doing IR and studying IR. We are living examples of that. You are living examples of that. Project it, I would say it's intellectual exhibitionism. There's nothing wrong with that kind of exhibitionism, because it would be the good kind of virus. You will be encouraging it to become infectious. Be as infectious as you can be in this noble endeavor that you are doing, because yes, academia in the Philippines has a lot of room for improvement, and you being there would really be able to pave the way. It's going to be groundbreaking, and we are showing the oldies that you need to unlearn and you need to learn further with us. Thank you so much.
In other words, Archie, go viral, right? Thank you for that inspiring words. And yeah, be an intellectual exhibitionist. We're all with you there. And perhaps, now we're talking about the mechanics or the tactics of how this conversation could pave the way for young scholars. And in CISO, as Romila had said, there's always a big space for these young scholars. And at this point, I'd like to call one of our principles also is, mentoring ourselves, mentoring each other, and mentoring everyone. So I'm taking this opportunity to show the other participants here that maybe next year, next FISO, you would constitute a panel or a roundtable, because you have a preview of how to do it. It's not so difficult. And in fact, difficulties are all part of the conversation. And I'd like to call Sir Kev Likayan, because he was the one who made it really difficult for the conversationalists to be part of this afternoon session. Yes, if you can just, show our fellow scholars how you did it with them for a very short time, how you spend time with them.
Thank you so much, Ms. Lorna. Actually, these students are my students in the graduate school, so I was mentoring them for a year already, and since I am the conference organizer, I use my what they call this, kamay na bakal, so to enforce that they have to present also well. So yeah, really thankful for the participants that they really answered to the call. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kev, and thank you so much for this afternoon session. I think we've covered a lot of ideas, covered a lot of roads, maybe destroyed some roads along the way. So again, let me acknowledge our conversationalists for this roundtable: Shane Vinarao, Danielle Rose Mañalac, Francis Therese Zabala, and Wing Christine Poon, who did not make it, but she is definitely part of this session. And there's a, you can, there's an evaluation that you need to fill out, and at some point, the certificate will be delivered to you via internet. Thank you so much, everybody. And I hope let's keep the conversation going. And I encourage everybody who are here to constitute, to compose another set of conversation in the next FISO conference. Thank you all, and magandang hapon sa ating lahat.